Here's the story of Uncle Pete and the air-colored house. Every small town has a few individuals who just seem to stand out in everyone's mind. Euphemistically referred to as characters, some of these folks are noted for their blatant disregard for established legislative statutes. Oh, skip the euphemism. Outlaws is how most people would describe them. Now, others are known for their salty language or idiosyncrasies. Foul-mouthed and weird are terms we use around here. And then there are those who are remembered for their good-natured humor and ability to spin a story, the more outrageous the better. One such character was Pete Honaker. Now, referred to by almost everyone as Uncle Pete, he lived in the Morehead area in the early 20th century. Uncle Pete was described as 5 feet 10, 5 feet 9 of which was mischievous grin. Kids and adults alike would gather whenever Uncle Pete held forth, for his stories, as far-fetched and unbelievable as they were always good for a shake of the head and a smile or a laugh. Uncle Pete always carried a goose bone in his pocket with which he would forecast the local weather. He never really explained how he performed this meteorological feat, but several times a day folks would stop Uncle Pete to ask about the weather. He would proffer his prognostication after mysteriously rubbing the aforementioned bone between his fingers and performing some type of mental divination. Of course, by modern standards, his weather predictions left a little to be desired. "Could rain today," he might say, or "I expect it'll warm up a tad tomorrow." Now, while specificity was not exactly his long suit, Uncle Pete did seem to hit it often enough to satisfy the local gentry, and so his reputation as a weatherman became somewhat legendary. Okay, it wasn't rocket science, but after shoveling 1.5 feet of partly cloudy out of my driveway on more than one occasion, I might just have preferred to take my chances with Uncle Pete, rather than putting my faith in the high-tech satellite-derived pronouncements of isobars, warm fronts, and probability of precipitation. Uncle Pete, however, professed to having one infallible method up his sleeve for knowing the weather. When pressed, his voice would get low and serious, and he would admit that he had a magical rain barrel in the back of his house. People don't have rain barrels anymore. They were simply big wooden barrels, often old whiskey barrels, which were used to catch rainwater off the roof or from the downspouts. That is, if your house was ritzy enough to have downspouts. The water was used to supplement well water for drinking, washing, and bathing. Well, Uncle Pete would explain to wide-eyed listeners that each morning he would look out of his back window at his magical rain barrel. If there were drops splashing in the barrel, it was raining. If he saw a bright reflection, the sun was shining. If the top of the barrel was white, it was snowing. And if there was ice on top of the barrel, hey, it was cold outside. Now, at this point, he couldn't help himself, and a big grin would spread across his face as his audience would realize that they'd just been had. In the old days, flooding was an every spring occurrence. Actually, it still is, but now we have FEMA to financially help us build back in the same hollows or along the same creek banks so that we can be flooded out again next spring. Water roars down and out of creek banks, sweeping away anything in its path. People and animals were often in danger, but the most frequent casualty was the family outhouse. After a particularly bad flood one spring, a salesman from up east — why is east up, anyway? Well, anyway, this salesman was traveling through the area. He heard about the recent flood and asked Uncle Pete how high the water had gotten. Uncle Pete, in a rare moment of unabashed truth, pointed about halfway up on a river maple still clinging precariously to the side of the creek. The salesman was incredulous, asking for proof that the water had actually risen that high. Uncle Pete, bit miffed that his veracity was being questioned, especially when he had made an exception and actually, at least temporarily though it was, squelched his mendacity. He pointed to a line of debris in the creek bank trees. This debris is always left in bushes and trees as the water recedes, and it's actually a pretty accurate indicator of the high water mark. "See those clumps of toilet paper clinging to those branches?" asked Uncle Pete. The salesman nodded that he did. "Well, I don't know about where you come from, but around here we usually don't climb trees to use the bathroom, and it sure as hell didn't grow there." Well, in March of another year, during an exceptionally bad flood, Uncle Pete witnessed a cow being swept away and carried downstream by the raging waters. The unfortunate animal was washed on downstream, never to be seen again. In the days that followed, Uncle Pete had the town astir with the news that a sea cow had been spotted in Triplet Creek. He did himself proud in his wondrous description of this mysterious creature's hideous appearance and terrifying utterances. Yes, pun fully intended. For the dubious, he directed them to a particular bend in the creek where he had first spotted this abomination. Just another tall tale, you say? Sure. But you'd be surprised how many townspeople, adults as well as kids, found themselves happening by that particular bend in the creek for months thereafter, professing it all nonsense, but keeping a sharp lookout nonetheless for Uncle Pete's sea cow. Well, perhaps the episode for which Uncle Pete is best remembered started one day at Crawford's barber shop, which was also the unofficial meeting place for most of the men in town. They would drop by, sit a spell, and catch up on all the news, local and otherwise. When Uncle Pete made his appearance, he was immediately enjoined to bring everyone up to date on his affairs, as they all knew that once you got Uncle Pete started, a good story would usually follow. "I just finished building me a house on that parcel of land I got up Dry Creek," he said. "Now, Uncle Pete," chided one of the barbershop regulars, "I was just up that way this morning, and I didn't see any house." "No wonder," huffed Uncle Pete. "I painted it air color. As a matter of fact, see this cut?" he said, pointing to a small scratch on his forehead. "When I finished painting it, I couldn't see it no more. Wandered around for 45 minutes looking for the dang thing. Might still be looking, except I bumped into the porch. Leastways, I think it was the porch. Dang near knocked me down." Well, everyone had a good laugh about Uncle Pete's air-colored house, and he was the subject of some good-natured ribbing. Uncle Pete stuck to his guns, however, insisting that the house was real and not just a figment of his all-too-well-known imagination. Upon leaving, he uttered that he would prove to everyone its reality. The next day, Uncle Pete was walking by the barber shop when several patrons called out the door for him to join them. They immediately launched into more jesting about his invisible house. "Ain't invisible no more," pronounced Uncle Pete, "leastways not altogether. When I went home yesterday, I felt around till I found it again, and so I wouldn't keep losing the darn thing, I painted me a red stripe all the way around it." In response to the incredulous laughter, Uncle Pete retorted, "If you don't believe me, just drop by my property. Can't see the house, of course, but you will be able to see the stripe I painted around it." With that, he exited to the renewed merriment of the barbershop crowd. Later that day, however, one of the regulars burst into the shop to announce that he had just driven by Uncle Pete's place, and indeed there really was a red stripe about 4 feet off the ground, turning corners and outlining the shape of a house. Well, the mad scramble was on. The barbershop cleared in seconds. Even old man Crawford closed up his shop, for this was not an event to be missed. The word soon spread, and before long a cavalcade of horses, buggies, and cars were headed up Dry Creek Road to Uncle Pete's. Uncle Pete was nowhere to be seen. His property sat back from the road about 100 yards or so, but even from that distance, everyone could see the heralded red stripe seemingly floating in the air, nothing above, nothing below. Heads turned, mouths gaped open, one woman pronounced it a miracle, and Preacher Johnson started to offer up a prayer. But the folks there assembled politely reminded him that he might not wish to pray over this thing until it could be figured out whether it was the work of the Lord or the devil. Besides, they all knew that once he got started, a person could starve to death before he uttered his final amen. Well, the mystery was solved when a couple of brave youngsters ventured over to the property. Uncle Pete had stuck welding rods in the ground at various locations and strung red tape from rod to rod. The rods being so thin they couldn't be seen from the road, and so the illusion was pretty effective from that distance. Uncle Pete was mischievous, but never mean-spirited, so he never mentioned his air-colored house again. Needless to say, a lot of red-faced townspeople were only too glad to forget it as well. Over the years, the stories resurfaced, and to this day, despite the fact that Uncle Pete's been telling his tales to St. Peter for many years now and his property long since sold and developed, many of the old-timers who find themselves on Dry Creek Road smile and cast a wistful glance as they go by Uncle Pete's old place. Who knows? Someone might just paint another stripe around Uncle Pete's air-colored house.